So now I'm going to ask Sydney a question because Sydney is 20 and I'm not. And uh, someone my age has been through many rounds. If we use a sort of boxing analogy, I've been through 12 rounds of this stuff. And as you get older, you either get more bitter or, touch wood, you get a teeny bit wiser about why this stuff needs to be addressed. But when you're 20, and I certainly would say this was the case for myself, you seem to be wandering around in white noise quite often. So if, Sydney, you help listeners understand the sort of things that you might have experienced, can you think of circumstances where someone of an older generation, a professor, a friend of a parent, or something like that, let's leave your family out of it for a second, where you have been repeatedly condescended to, for example, or someone has used a certain pattern of language which is not necessarily abusive but rude, and you haven't done something about it?
Yes.
Tell us a bit, even you don't have to mention names, probably better that you don't, but tell us about perhaps a context so that when people are doing this exercise, perhaps it might prompt them to think about what they might do. What's a situation that you found yourself in where you felt two things? One, a certain resentment against this individual who's not been very nice, and perhaps a resentment against yourself, a part of yourself that you haven't actually dealt with in.
Yes, well, I think mainly like if I've been to certain dinners or something, whether
Yeah.
it's like with friends or just special occasions in my community, I think mainly some grown-ups in that area kind of have different relationships with the younger generation, and sometimes I felt like with some older people that if I'm at the dinner table or something with them at this certain event and then it's my turn to speak, they kind of are just like, oh, let's let her just talk it out, and they don't really pay attention at all to it, the actual words that are coming out of me, but they just let me ramble on to get my, I guess, 2 cents in, but don't really take anything in consideration.
And if you were to put a little bit more heat under that situation, have there been situations where someone has actually used a turn of phrase that is positively rude, that they've actually put you down, or they've swatted the validity of what you're saying to one side, they've sort of talked over you or anything like that?
It's mainly either talked over me or if they're asking a certain question, and it might even just be a common sense question on a certain directions to get to somewhere, like to another restaurant or to a place that they're going to or something, advice if they're traveling somewhere, and you give your input, then they'll like repeat it, but completely like repeat your answer, but they do it like over, and then everyone else around you is kind of like, that's what she just mentioned.
So they've stolen your
Yeah.
advice and they make it their own.
Yeah, and they make it like it came to them instantly. But it happens with a lot of, I mean, not just me. I've seen a lot of, even with my friends or something. Like if we're around older people in certain situations, sometimes they'll do that.
And have you had interaction with an individual who's done this repeatedly?
Um, I wouldn't say a specific individual, but
Okay, because I think the key thing is if it's a one-off situation with a semi-stranger, then I think often that it's probably advisable to let these things
yeah.
go a bit because life is short and we don't want to create conflict where it's unnecessary. I think if we do another little quote, and this is from Nelson Mandela, his angle on this was fools multiply when wise men and women stay silent. Say that one more time. Fools multiply when wise men and women stay silent. So these are two men who had great civic responsibility. They both ended up the leaders of their newly independent countries. We can say, the birth of India and the birth of modern South Africa. These were the men that actually allowed that transition to occur. With Nelson Mandela, I don't know if you know this, but with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, uh, instigated an extraordinary thing called the Truth and Reconciliation Initiative in South Africa, where he brought um, not all, but very many of the abuses, which included murder and torture and goodness knows what, during the period of apartheid in South Africa, he brought it out into the open through a process of open court, where people were not sent to jail. They basically had to just confess or talk about the atrocities that had occurred. And really, what this fools multiply when wise men stay silent seems to me a kissing cousin to that idea that the truth is really bloody important. If we don't actually have to blame, condemn, have revenge, or anything like that. We just need to state the truth in order for us to live in a better world. So, if you're being condescended to by some stranger who walks through an airport asking for where the checkout desk is, forget it. But if it is your uncle, or it is your regular teacher, or if it is a friend, then I think we need to, because actually we die by increment if we don't address it. So, um, what about earlier when I was asking Sydney or talking about trauma, she had an interesting expression on her face because she was thinking, do I have an equivalent trauma to the ones that you're describing? Without going into any detail, can you think of relationships, that sustained relationships that have caused you discomfort in your young life?
Like specific relationship. I think it's just kind of um, growing up and dealing with like certain judgments and like insecurities when you're with like I just feel like certain people especially I guess a girl growing up, you have I feel like you can never win in a sense. So if you feel confident on something, something might turn, and then just people in your area, general like they you feel like you're constantly judged on certain behaviors.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably I would say the most like trauma that's happened to me. But the main thing that's put me I guess through that is surrounding myself with great people like friends to get me through that to show me basically what really matters.
And this is such a huge issue, isn't it? I've got two daughters. It's something that I think about a lot. My daughters are only 13 and 9 years old. So what I'm anticipating in a way is what you've probably been living through for the last 4 or 5 years. As you hit your sort of mid-teens and you're suddenly having to interact with older adults who, as you've already said, can be condescending, flip, can steal your ideas, and they're basically being pretty disrespectful. How does one address that, particularly as a young woman? One of the things you've talked about is surrounding yourself with a support network, presumably mainly with other young women. But is there anything that you can think of that you could do that would be in the ballpark that we're discussing here, which is where you're more assertive with the transgressors? There were people who are actually actively being judgmental of you on the basis either of your age or gender or whatever it is. Are there things that are sort of ticking away in the back of your mind, which strategies that you could employ that would improve the quality of your life and address this crap?
I think honestly, just to, I mean, I know this sounds very silly, but just to kind of, I mean, I don't know if there's necessarily a certain like person to address, just not let them just own your stuff, own your stuff and let that kind of embrace your own individuality. Because I know, like, for instance, this, like, when I was younger, and I always talk to my friends about this who did like gymnastics with me, is that when you're so young, you're not afraid to fall at all. But then suddenly, especially for girls, when you turn like 13, 12, whatever, there's this confidence in you that just like completely brushes away. And not if you think that you're an insecure person, but it just brushes away. And I even ended up getting into like tumbling and stuff later in my teens, like 16, 17. And I was like, how am I not doing? I was more advanced when I was younger. How am I not? And then it's all because you're not afraid to fall or to fail when you're younger.
Yeah.
And I think that's the main thing. I think, and a lot of times with girls especially, it's not even a specific person, it's just this whole persona. And a lot of times it happens with girls judging other girls, which should not be the case. But yeah. I think mainly, like I said, that whole support system is probably the most assertiveness and kind of just saying, I am who I am, own it. There's nothing that can really happen. People have to deal with it. Yeah. So as long as, yeah.
It feels like we're covering a lot of ground here. There seems to be, to me, I don't know if I'm right, 2 or 3 really, really big interrelated issues, and let's talk about this a little bit more, because I think it is such an important issue, and there's a very strong light being shone on some of these issues politically right now in the US and here in Europe, which is I suppose, gender politics in a broad sense. Let's be careful what we say here. But one of them, I think, which you touched on, is this bizarre occurrence that happens somewhere in most young women or older girls, mid-teens, where that confidence just seems to, as you say, disappear. And please do check out the newsletter we're going to have coming out in a few weeks, because there's an article in it which looks at that someone else has written. It's a fascinating study into why that might be. And there's a whole bunch of different things that contribute to it, not least hormones. Actually, some very strange things start to happen in all our bodies, girls and boys, when we hit our mid-teens. So that's an issue. What I'm interested in as an adjunct to that is the way in which we use our intellect, irrespective of what's going on in our bodies, to sustain a sense of self-esteem. And I think, of course, what I would call the sort of buddy network of our close friends is probably as important a thing as anything else. But I'm wondering whether the exercises that I'm suggesting that we do now is something that we can add to it, and that is where we understand that this is obviously my own little obsession. The way in which we build a narrative about who we are provides the bedrock for the way in which we can survive ongoing conflict and trauma. I do think that that is probably the most important thing. And the exercises that I've suggested that you might find useful, where you adopt the heroic qualities of a friend or a colleague or a mentor and employ them in your imagination to confront, if you like, wrongdoing, is the same thing. If you can imagine those qualities and construct a story where you employ them, you already are a heroine or a hero.